So welcome, dear friends. I'm John, Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session. Their very special guest today, my friend Kerry Kennedy. You can find many other great upcoming Zooms at www.beatitudecenter.org. Let me remind those who are listening live to mute yourselves and write any questions or comments in the chat link. I'm hoping Kerry will speak 45 minutes or longer, whatever she wants, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments for 45 minutes. And later I will send out the Zoom recording link. So let's all begin with a little prayer, everybody. So I invite us to take a moment of silence and just to relax and notice how you're feeling today in this world we're in. And I invite you to enter into the presence of the God of peace, who loves you personally, infinitely, and to welcome the nonviolent Jesus into our hearts and ask for whatever graces of peace, hope, and love we need to carry on our mission as peacemakers. Beloved God, thank you for all the blessings of life and hope and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect with our friend Kerry on your call to serve humanity, defend and restore human rights for every human being, to welcome your reign of peace with justice here on earth. Disarm us, inspire us, heal us, enlighten us, and strengthen us to go forward and do what we can to help end violence, injustice, war, racism, poverty, executions, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction, that we might all follow the nonviolent Jesus ever more faithfully and do your will and be who you created us to be, your beloved peacemakers, your beloved sons and daughters. We ask this mighty blessing in Jesus' name, amen. So
Amen.
we're gathering, friends, those who are watching this in the recording in January 2025, on the 23rd anniversary of Guantanamo prison, where there's still about 15 prisoners, 6 of whom were never charged. And we're working on, some of us here, ending the death penalty in every case and freeing Leonard Peltier. I'm thinking, Kerry, of we're mourning Jimmy Carter. And years ago, Jimmy Carter invited me to come out to his house for a day to have a quiet, day-long conversation on peace. And he talked a lot about the connection between human rights and nonviolence and peacemaking, which was so beautiful. So it's with that in mind that I'm very happy to welcome to this Beatitude Center project and introduce all of you to my friend Kerry Kennedy, who I think, don't listen to this part, Kerry, is one of the world's leading human rights activists. She's the director of the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights. If you haven't looked it up, it's at rfkhumanrights.org. For those of you who don't know, long ago in 1981 and 82, the only job I ever had in my life, before I entered the Jesuits, I worked for the RFK Memorial before it became Human Rights as the assistant to the director, to RFK's best friend, our friend David Hackett. So this is a special blessing for me. As Kerry's the author of many great books. I think this is my favorite, Kerry. You can all see it. R.F. Kennedy, Ripples of Hope. It's so beautiful. This masterpiece of photographs, I don't know if you can all see it, Speak Truth to Power. It's just an amazing, amazing book. And others, being Catholic now, she's devoted 40 years to this pursuit of equal justice, the promotion and protection of basic human rights, the upholding of law around the world, on all kinds of issues, from child labor to indigenous land rights, disappearances, freedom of expression, ethnic violence, the criminal justice system, immigration, environmental justice, and so on. And she's a lawyer and has written extensively and been on television reporting on all this. She served as the chair of the Amnesty International Leadership Council. Last Saturday, she represented her family in accepting the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Biden in honor of her beloved father, Robert F. Kennedy. Congratulations on that, Kerry. So, dear friends, please give a rousing, warm welcome of applause on Zoom to my friend, Kerry
Thank you.
Kennedy. Kerry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Thank you for those words. And for those of you who might be confused, we're talking about my father, not my brother, winning that award and the organization named after him. First of all, I just want to say thank you. I love John. That commitment to peace, to justice, to human rights, and doing it all through the spiritual path and then the name of Jesus is deeply meaningful to me. And so I want to thank you for your leadership, John, after all of these years. Also, I'd love this to be a dialogue, so maybe I'll just start and talk a little bit about how I became involved in human rights, and then talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing today, and then open it up, you know, on the earlier side. But my earliest memories are of going to the Justice Department when my father was the Attorney General of the United States at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. And my mother and father really didn't separate their home life from their work, then from Daddy's work life. And we always had civil rights activists and Indigenous leaders and farm workers at our home. And equally, we were also always going to his office. And I remember one day, my mother put 6 or 7 of us into her convertible, along with 2 or 3 dogs, and not small little lap dogs, like huge, a Newfoundland and a sheepdog, like big dogs. And always a football. And we went to go see my dad, and we ran around his office, and then we would always go, there's a elevator down to the basement of the Justice Department, and you could walk through a tunnel and you'd get to the FBI building, and then you could see the sharpshooters had practice. So we loved to go and do that. And so we were watching the sharpshooters, and my mother saw that there was a suggestion box in the bottom of the FBI building. Now, the head of the FBI at that time was a guy called J. Edgar Hoover. Who remembers J. Edgar Hoover? Okay, so J. Edgar Hoover, as you know, was not known for his sense of humor or his love of children. And so and he once wrote that the biggest threats to American democracy are Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. And my father was his boss at the time. And so my mother wrote a suggestion and put it in the box. And then while she was gathering up all those children and dogs and the football and trying to pull us together and bring us back up to Daddy's office, an astute FBI agent took the suggestion and brought it up to J. Edgar Hoover, who read it and then had it sent to Daddy's office, so that as we were walking back into his office, my father was reading the suggestion, and the suggestion was get a new director. And no, this was an early lesson in the importance of speaking truth to power and having a sense of humor at all times about activism. I had the most idyllic childhood that anyone could ever wish upon a child. A wonderful, strong family, a deep sense of faith, you know, all of the physical needs that I could possibly dream of were not just met, but overflowing. Great schools, great friends, all of that. But there were things that happened in my childhood that even with all that superstructure and even with all that wealth in every way you can imagine it, they threw me off balance. So one of my earliest memories is of the death of my uncle, President Kennedy, who of course was killed by a man with a handgun. Over the next 5 years, our country was just fraught with this violence. And we lost Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, then of course in April 1968, Martin Luther King, and 6 weeks later, my father on June 6, 1968. It's hard to describe the impact on a child of losing your father at such a young age. And a lot of people stepped in to help, but there's one thing that no one else can do, and losing a parent at that age leaves the work of love undone. And then I was in 3rd grade at that time. And then when I was in 6th grade, a friend of mine came to me and said her father is beating up her mother and she didn't know what to do with it. And then I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if this was a secret, if I should tell my mother. These are people who are at our house every weekend. This is a man who I loved, who I played football with, who I went swimming with. How was I supposed to look at him? A woman who I loved, I didn't know how to protect her. It was scary. And then when I was in high school, 2 of my best friends were raped on a double date with men they'd just met. And one of my best friends was one of the earliest people in our country to die from HIV/AIDS. And he was gay, but he was not out of the closet because there was so much oppression against sexual minorities. And so each of those actions just threw me off base. And then when I was in college, I got a job working at Amnesty International, and somebody handed me a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I read that document and it changed my life. And I realized that everything that had been so traumatic in my childhood all had one thing in common, and they were all violations of international human rights. And that I could use that document in order to create change. And I saw people using that document to create change all over the world, whether they were anti-apartheid activists in South Africa or Polish solidarity leaders or the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina, in Chile, and El Salvador, and others across the globe. And so I decided to become a lawyer and spend the rest of my life using that document to stop human rights violations. And that's how I got to where I am today. So where is it that I am today? So today I run, as John said, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. It was started in '68 to carry forward Daddy's unfinished work on social justice. And today we do 3 major things. One is we hold governments accountable for human rights violations. We do that through suing governments, mostly advocacy and litigation. We have about 35 lawsuits at any given time internationally. And we take on cases that are strategic litigation. So they're like a Brown v. Board for their countries. So the first case in Latin America holding a government accountable for the assassination of a journalist We won in Colombia a few years ago, the first case in the history of Latin America holding a government accountable for the killing of an LGBTQ person. We won in Honduras 2 years ago. And in the court, there's a Supreme Court that sits above all the Supreme Courts of Latin America and one for Africa, and that's where we have most of these cases. So we just won a case about 2 months ago in Ethiopia. It was the first case in the history of Africa holding a government accountable for the failure of holding a free and fair election. Domestically, that work holding governments accountable is mostly around the criminal legal system and racism within the criminal legal system. That's one part of it. And the second part is violations of human rights committed by immigration officials, mostly against people of color in our system. That's holding governments accountable. That's one chunk. Second chunk is when I was growing up, the largest economies were countries. Today, of the 100 largest economies on the earth, 70 of them are multinational corporations. 5 years ago, 50 were. So as corporations become more and more powerful in our lives, it's increasingly important to hold them accountable as well as we do nations for human rights violations. So we work with the investment community on putting downward pressure on corporations to keep them in compliance with human rights norms. And then the third thing we do is we train the next generation of human rights defenders, kindergarten through law school. And I think I'll leave it right there for right now. And if anybody has any questions, I'll answer them. And if you don't, we can all go home and have lunch.
Thank you so much, Kerry. No, I got questions for you, and I'm sure people have. So when did you start at RFK as the director?
Well, I was on the board in 81. And then I started working there full time when I finished law school in 86. And I was running our human rights program.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started running the whole thing in, let's say, well, a couple of years after that. Then I stopped for a while to have children and came back, and
Yeah.
here I am.
I remember 25 years ago when you won't remember this, we had lunch in Manhattan, and you said, I asked you what you were doing, and you said, I never forgot it. One of the things we try to do is go into a country in Africa, Latin America, and highlight the Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez in that country, maybe give them an award or something. Do you remember that? Are you still doing that?
Yes, so thank you for for
And can you tell us about some of those people you've met around the world that we wouldn't know? That's incredible thing
sure.
among all this incredible stuff you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, so our philosophy was always a lot of our colleague organizations have an agenda. So maybe if it's Article 19, which is an organization, that agenda is to protect free expression all over the world. And then Amnesty has its agenda, Human Rights Watch, and they're really, really important, and they're great colleagues, and we partner with them all over the place. But we had a sort of a different take on it. Our take was, we're not going to go into a country and say, this is what we want to do. We're going to go into a country and find the greatest community leader who is creating the greatest change. And then we're going to partner with that person and bring our resources to their issue. So that was a different kind of philosophy. And
So who have you been
So,
supported over the
so,
decades?
and
It's
I'll
such
tell
a-
you an example of how that philosophy makes a difference. Um, one of our one of our laureates is from Western Sahara. And that's a whole big story, which I can go into at some point. But anyway, I said to her, "What's holding you back? What's the one thing that if you could change, it would allow your work to flourish?" And she said, "Well, it's that the police are constantly threatening my daughter with rape. And that's the thing that preoccupies me the most, how to protect her." So we got her a 4-year scholarship to a college in France and got her out of the country for 4 years. And then this woman could go do her work. So you can do that if you're person first, but you can't do that if you're issue first, because it would never occur to you to ask the question. And
Wow.
that's the difference. Um, I'll tell you an example of one of my superheroes that because I'm actually trying to reach her today. Her name is Loon Vio. So Loon Vio, you all must know Paul Farmer. Some of you know Paul Farmer.
Yeah, he was my college friend, remember?
Okay, great. So he's just another superhero. So Loon and Paul were partners in Haiti in addressing healthcare issues in Haiti. And Loon was in a meeting. There had been 3 colossal hurricanes that had decimated much of the country. And so she was in a meeting with the other heads of hospitals and organizations, with the Minister of Health of Haiti, and he was standing at the end of the room in front of a blackboard, and he was writing some numbers on the wall. And all of a sudden, the wall in back of him just fell down, and it was open, and the whole building started to shake, and Loon and everybody dove underneath the table, and that was the great earthquake in Port-au-Prince. I'm sure you all remember. And then Loon made her way, sort of dusted herself off, and made her way to the central hospital. And when she got to the central hospital, there was a woman who was running it. It's the biggest hospital in Haiti. And she said, "How can I help?" And you know, the whole place was in ruins. The split in the earth during the earthquake happened across the street from the central hospital. And it happened underneath the School of Nursing. So all of the nursing teachers and all of that generation of nurses died in 30 seconds. It was just a horrific loss. And so Loon was, making her way through this rubble and said to the head of the hospital, "How can I help?" The head of the hospital said, "Listen, I can take care of the hospital and all of our people, but I cannot do that and take care of room 53B. So Loon made her way to room 53B, and it was a large closet. And in the closet were 8 beds, 8 cribs, and each crib held 4 children. And all of those children had intellectual disabilities and physical deformities. One of those kids had been there for 13 years. And they had been left by their families who couldn't take care of them upon birth. And the hospital didn't have resources to take care of them, so they were doing the best that they could. One nurse, 32 kids, none of them could, change a diaper or anything. So Loon went and found the Minister of Health that very same day. I mean, think about this. Found the Minister of Health and said, "Oh, I want to take care of those kids." And the Minister of Health said, "I can't give you those children unless you get permission from the Minister of Children's Affairs, because that's the person who's in charge of children once they leave the hospital." So she found the Minister of Children's Affairs, God knows how. And she said, I want to take the kids. And he said, you can't take them off hospital grounds. It's completely not allowed. And she said, well, how can you take them? Only if they're adopted. And you know what she said? I'm adopting all 32 of them right now. She had no place to take them. She had no funding. She had no resources, but she saw that need and she said, I'm going to figure out how to do it. And it's going to work. And so she adopted 32 children. And she then found she was helped by some really wonderful people. And then about a month later, she found a guy who had abandoned his little farm that was now in downtown Port-au-Prince because the city had grown around it. And she took over that farm and she built this incredible place called Zanmi Beni. Now, let me just go on a little bit about Zun. So she now has these 32 kids, and kids keep coming in because they've lost their family during the earthquake. So now she's got 72 kids. And they are eating, she just doesn't have enough money to feed them. So she starts a chicken farm in that community, in that little, farm that she had. So she had enough eggs. Then they were eating so much protein, they couldn't get enough protein. So she started a tilapia farm in the same place. And then they took the extra tilapia and they would sell it in the local market. Then they had so many visitors that she started a restaurant so that she could teach, some of the kids who were able how to work in a restaurant, and she would have a way that all the visitors to her program could pay for their food. And they would make a profit and then go use that. And then she started a bakery. I mean, just an extraordinary figure. And all tied to her profound spiritual life. So that's one example of the type of people I work
That's amazing, Kerry. Um, you've been all over the world. And it seems to me, I don't know how many nations, and I want to ask you about some of them. So can you tell me about, because I never get to ask you these questions, about your experience in South Africa? Your mother told me some of that. And what about Central America, where I lived? Back in the day and now.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. John was close to my mom and came to visit her many times, particularly over the last decade. And we lost my mother in October, but and John was there for the funeral mass and really was wonderful. But and she really thought you was a great friend. So thank you, John. Yeah, so South Africa was a special place for our family because in 1966, when most Americans had never heard of apartheid, my father and mother went to South Africa. And they were supposed to go with this whole group of journalists and others. And at the last minute, the government of South Africa said, no, you can only go with 3 of your staff people and your wife. And so they arrived, and it was very, it was a scary time. The year before, the founding Secretary General of the United Nations was killed, and it was pretty clear to everybody that he was killed by the South African military when he was in a helicopter. And the first thing they did when they got there is they were told, we will supply you with a helicopter to go to a remote part of the country. The helicopter they got was shocking pink. So my mother always remembered this weird kind of shocking pink helicopter, but it was a scary time because who knew what was going to happen. They went around the country and they spoke to students about their capacity to make a difference, a lot to white audiences about their moral responsibility to create change. And they ended up at the University of Cape Town, where my father gave an extraordinary speech, which I highly recommend, called the Ripple of Hope speech. It's the Day of Affirmation speech, where he laid out the 4 reasons that change does not occur, why we don't create change, which is a great sort of handbook for activism for all of you, because I know John's audience are activists, so highly recommend that. I went to South Africa many times after that, many times, because we were working with anti-apartheid leaders and Archbishop Tutu, and then of course Mandela once he was released. And I have to say, again, some of the bravest people I know. You know, it's interesting about South Africa because in the human rights field, almost all of the activists you meet are people who come from an oppressed group and work with their communities to stop the oppression. That's almost everybody. Then there's another much smaller group, which I would call activists without boundaries. And that's somebody from, from Iowa who goes to Rwanda and tries to help out in a controversy that they have no truck with, no history with, no reason, except that they want to help. That's John Deere going to Latin America in the 1980s. And then the third group, and this is very unusual, is people who stand up to their family and their friends and their own communities and risk being ostracized by their communities in order, because they see that their communities, their source of power is oppressing others, and that they're going to risk losing their position in society and their loved ones and their community for doing that. And there was quite a bit of that in South Africa. So it was really an extraordinary experience to work with people across all 3 types of communities.
Kerry, thank you. I mean, I'd like to go around the planet and ask you questions, but since and I might if we have time. But and I know there's questions already. Someone will eventually we'll get to Gaza and what can we do today. But you're in South Africa. I want to read the Ripples of Hope quote because it is so beautiful. And you titled it on your book. This is from your father. And I'd like to ask you to reflect on that because I've known it since I worked for David Hackett and loved it. And we all need to hope and to do actions that are going to, lead to more ripples of hope in today's world. So here's the Robert Kennedy quote, and I'm going to ask Kerry to just take a little bit to reflect on it. I'm sure you've read it a billion times or quoted it, but you can never read enough. Each time a person stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. I think that's Gandhian and Kingian nonviolence as bottom-up people power organized grassroots campaigns of nonviolence. I think that's Jesus too, organizing 72 people to march from Galilee to Jerusalem, saying, I'm sending you like lambs into the midst of wolves. Jesus as a movement leader. Um, and it's so amazing he said that in 65,
Yeah.
because there was like before the Vietnam War and Dr. King's sudden work on the Poor People's Campaign. Anyway, tell us a little bit about that great hope, that message in whatever way you want
I mean, I
to
think,
encourage us, Kerry, to encourage us.
yeah, I think, um, you know, he talked in that speech that few people are able to move history itself. Um, but we can all change a small portion of events. And in the culmination of those acts will be written the history of this generation. So I think that people, that we're too often, we think, well, I can't do that because I didn't win the Nobel Prize, or I'm not president, or I don't, I'm not a cabinet official, or I don't have the authority, or I don't have the finances, or I don't have the whatever it is it takes to be able, I don't have that power. We're always thinking about the power we don't have. But what that is saying is we do have power to do something. We all have power to do something. And so just use the power that you've got it's like when I talk to kids, I say, you don't have to go change the world. Go home tonight and do the dishes. Like, just do something for somebody else that you don't normally do. Go make your bed, bring your parents something to eat, do the dishes, cook a meal, do something for somebody else that you don't normally do. And that's how we're going to make massive change through people. In my experience in human rights, the difference between a hero and a victim is activism with a loving heart. So when you think about Martin Luther King in the Birmingham jail, you don't think about a victim. Of course, he was a victim. You don't think about a victim, you think about a hero. And that's because he wouldn't be victimized by the people who were harming him. He was motivated by that loving heart, and he wrote that beautiful letter from a Birmingham jail. And that's true all over the place. I mean, just think about, who are your heroes? Malala. Was she a victim, or was she a hero? She's a hero because even though she was victimized, she stood up. She kept going. If you think about John Lewis, and you think about any of these, Wangari Maathai, think about Martin Sheen, who I know is a great friend of John's, who just kept standing up and just kept going out and protesting and kept taking his belief, his spiritual life, and putting that forward and saying, I'm going to do what I can. And that's what that quote is about.
That's so great. Let me ask you another famous phrase, which is the title on your incredible book.
Speak to the power.
Remember, Jackson Brown gave this to me in 1995.
Oh,
And for those of you who don't have it, it's a picture of, some great hero. Here's Jose Ramos Horta. Anyway, speak truth to power. And that led to the performances that Martin did and traveling around the world. And tell us about speaking truth to power, especially now in a culture when lies and fake news are as we move deeper into fascism. Um, about even in small, tiny ripples ways, the importance of speaking out and speaking it to power. You might have called that prophetic work long ago in the scriptures. And that's certainly what Dr. King did. In other words, publicly speaking out. Because Kerry, you've been speaking out publicly, and that's what I learned from Daniel Berrigan as a kid, that this is all fine and good, but we got to take our love and truth and peacemaking public, if you see. And
mm.
not everybody does that. And so how do we do that, and what advice do you have about speaking truth to power in these times?
Well, let me just say a little bit about that. So speak truth to power, it sounds like a biblical phrase, but it was the name of a pamphlet in the 1950s written by by a religious order. I'm trying to remember who
It was the Quakers, wasn't it?
was the Quakers, right? Was the Quakers. And it was a pamphlet on why they should support the civil rights activists. And let me give you it. So I spent 2.5 years traveling around the world, interviewing the greatest heroes on earth, people who had faced imprisonment, torture, and death for basic rights most of us take for granted. And I was trying to get at who are these people and what motivates them and what do they have in common. One thing that they almost all had in common was that they had a strong religious background at some point in their lives. And a weirdly high number of them were taught by Jesuits, like really high number all over the world.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And the other thing they had was universally a great sense of humor. If I go back and listen to my
Yes.
tapes and my interviews, I am laughing in every single one. It's
Yeah.
striking.
It makes sense too.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the people I met while I was writing that book was a woman. She was a nun from Mexico. And I said to her, how'd you get involved? And she said that her father was a union activist, and they lived in a tiny little town and up a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, and there was only one place to work in the town. And whenever he would try and engage management, they always suppressed them so that they would go on strike, and then the police would be called in, and then they would pick up all the strikers and take them to jail and torture them and never address the issues. So she said, so we couldn't afford a lawyer, and I wanted to be the type of lawyer who could help people like me. So I said, well, tell me about a typical case. And she said, well, a few weeks ago, a woman came and said that her husband had been disappeared. He was an activist, and he was speaking out, and he had been disappeared by the military. And but they had a rumor that he was being held in a military hospital not far away from Mexico City. So I said, what did you do? And she said, well, I went to the hospital. And I said, well, weren't you scared? And she said, yeah, I was terrified because I've been tortured by those people and I know what they could do. But I had to go and see him. He was going to be my client. So, and I said, what happened? She said, well, I just asked at the front desk, can I see him? And they said no. And so I waited till there was a shift change and I just walked past the guards. And she said she went up to the second floor and she looked around and there was only one room that had a nurse standing outside the room. So she went and said, my client is in there. And the nurse said, you're not allowed in there. I'm not even allowed in there. The disappearcito is in there. The disappeared guy is in there. So she said, okay, now I know that's where my client is and I'm going in. So she said she was terrified because she knew on the other side of the door would not only be her client, but also the people who had beaten him so badly he had to be hospitalized. So she just mustered up all her courage and she opened the door and she said, and with all the authority I could muster, I said, you get out of here right now. This is my client and I'm his lawyer and I get 5 minutes alone with him. And these guards were kind of flustered and shocked and they walked out. And she said, that was kind of a miracle. She explained who she was, and the guy signed her up as a lawyer. So now she could get a habeas corpus decree from a judge. So she's proud of herself. She's walking back down the hall and here came these two thugs and obviously reprimanded for leaving their post. And they started towards her. And I said, so what did you do? She said, I assumed the attack position. Hey!
Oh my gosh.
And she's like, 4'4", maybe. And she's a nun and she's got the whole habit going and the big cross and everything. And these two guys were like so shocked to see this nun and then this indigenous person in the attack position. They said, what are you going to do? And she said, take one more step and you'll see. And they walked away. So she was able to escape and go to her car and get back to her office. And I said to her, tell me about that moment. How did you feel? And she said, I was expecting something about love or peace or Jesus. And what she said is, I'm just so angry. I'm so angry when I think about what they did to my family and to my community and to our country. And that gave me all the energy that I needed to confront them. And I think that's really important because we're told, because anger obviously can be a force for real destruction. We all know that, but it can also be a force for good. And, your anger comes when you see injustice. And so if you feel angry, you can say, what's the injustice here? And when you ask that question, sometimes you'll find that you need to let go of your anger. But sometimes you will find that you need to hold on to that anger in order to create positive change. And I remember, now I'm going on a little bit of a of a quest here, but my child was getting her first Holy Communion. And the priest was saying, okay, so your children are going to get their first Holy Communion. So before they can get that, they have to have their first confession. So we've written up a series of questions that they can ask themselves to prepare for their first confession. And they, and so and then the sheet goes, well, did I lie to my parents? Was I violent to a sibling? And then the end it says, did I get angry? So I raised my hand to the priest in the church. And I said, well, I mean, anger is not a sin. Anger is an emotion. And we can't deny the anger of our children. And he said, well, would you like to go to confession, Kerry? But I think, all of us who are trying to create change, and women in particular, are always told, no, you're not angry. But that's a form of suppression. We need to take that anger and use it to create change. And
Thank you.
we need to create change non-violently, but it doesn't mean you can't be angry at injustice.
Thank you. So there's so much to talk about. I wonder if you could reflect anything about the struggle for human rights in Gaza, which someone has asked about. That's one of the many questions that there are. And and I'm sure you've been involved in the Middle East for years, and I have too. Um, and but with in particular the genocide on the Palestinian people. Thoughts, suggestions, and everybody always is asked, what can we do? Any thoughts or comments on that? The question of Gaza.
Yeah. It's horrific to see what is happening in Gaza, and all it's one can't be human and watch that unfold without your heart breaking and wanting to reach out and wanting to create change and do something to make a difference. I think Gaza is clear, crystal clear, and complex. So on the crystal clear side, the slaughter of children, the denial of basic needs, food, clothes, water, medical supplies, is something that we can stand on very, very strong ground on and say, this is unacceptable. And that is, I think, the strongest place to create change, the strongest grounds to create change. I think there are other parts about that, what's unfolding there, that are more complicated and more legalistic and puts you on not as strong ground. But I think the main thing to do is to demand that the hostages get released, that there is a stop to hostilities, and that food, clothes, and medical supplies be humanitarian aid be fully available, and that those who have committed war crimes be prosecuted and held accountable. And I think that's the place that we've come out as a human rights organization on the issue.
And it's like that with so many other wars and conflicts around the world, stop it now and resolve. Someone has also asked about nuclear weapons, which is something that, I've been working on all my life, the abolition of nuclear weapons. Because Pope Francis talks about we're in World War III piecemeal now. It's happening. That's his phrase. And, Gaza and Ukraine and the wars in Africa and meanwhile, the war on the poor and so forth. But on top of all of this, we're closer to nuclear war than ever.
Yeah.
And we still have 13,000 nuclear weapons. On a little side note, I don't know if I ever told you this. About 10 years ago, my friend Jim Douglas and I spent a couple days with Adam Walensky, and he gave us the boxes of the actual type speeches he wrote for your dad. And the first speech, I'm sure you know this, the very first speech your father gave in the U.S. Senate in early January 1965 was about the abolition of nuclear weapons. I never knew that my whole life. It was brilliant and scary because right on the heels of his brother and so forth. Can you talk about the abolition of nuclear weapons as well in terms of human rights, the right to live in a world without nuclear weapons, or
Yeah.
the right to peace? And therefore, ultimately, where I'm going to ask you next is about human rights and peacemaking. But for now,
Yeah.
nukes.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. We need to to rid the world of all nuclear weapons. I mean, honestly, if you want to know my plan,
Yeah, I
I
do.
mean, the goal should be to disband every army on earth and have all armies be run by the United Nations. And therefore there will not be any war. And then take all that money we spend on the military and spend it on humanitarian aid and making the world a better place.
Which
Thank
is
you.
totally doable because
I mean, it should be doable. That's
the U.S.
exactly what
It's
what
just
what
a
our
new global Marshall Plan. You know,
exactly.
after World War II, you take the $1 trillion spent on nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, and you feed everybody. And the UN says with the infinite money left over, then you can educate every human being in nonviolent conflict resolution. Let me ask you about the death penalty, which I think you and your mom were against. And
Yeah, my mother didn't really, she didn't really get involved with the death penalty that much, but I'll tell you my story with the death penalty, which is when my dad died, I um I was at home in I was at home in I was in California with him when he got shot, and then I was 8 and went back to Virginia, which is where our home was. And my brother called me and said that he had passed. And I went to my room and I laid on my bed and I cried in my pillow for my father and how much we would miss him. And then I just prayed to God for daddy. And then I really prayed to God for the person who had killed him. And I said, I just, please don't let anyone hurt him, because I don't want anyone else, any other family going through what we're going to go through now. And I don't want, maybe as kids, I don't want those kids to lose their parent, or maybe as parents, I don't want the parents to lose their child. I don't want any of that. Just stop it. We have
thank you
this
so
this
much for that.
and so that was the instinct of an 8-year-old. But that had a wisdom of a child in it. And that's how I feel today about the death penalty. And listen, I'll tell you a story about what can we do and the death penalty and what little you can do. So I did this show in 1990. I was working for CNN on a show about environment and human rights. And I went to, okay, this is a funny story. So I was living in Queens, New York. So I got into a taxi and I drove to 45 minutes JFK airport. And then I took a 12-hour flight to Singapore, and then like an 8-hour flight to Manila. And then I took a 3.5-hour flight to a city called Palawan, an island called Palawan. And then I got into a car and I got on a bus and I went for about 6 hours, and then I got out of the bus and got into a Jeep and I went into the rainforest for another, 4 or 5 hours. And I was with a crew from CNN. And then we got to a river, and the river is only 20 feet across, but the story was on the other side of the river and there was no way of getting across this river. So I said, what are we going to do? So we waited around a few hours and a guy comes by with a canoe. And he says, do you want to ride across? Yes, we would like a ride across. So we take the ride across. And at the end, I go and give him a little tip. And he says, thank you very much. And he gives me his business card. Okay, this is so funny and very, very typical Filipino. Everybody has a business card. So great. I said, thank you very much. I gave him my business card. And that was the end of that. And then we did the story, and that's a whole other story, blah, blah, blah. So now 1995, 5 years later, I bring home twins on April 11th. Today, I gave birth to twins. And I bring them home to my house and I put them down, get settled for the first time. And I walk into my office and in my house, on my little desk, and there's a letter, and I open the letter and it says, "Dear Kerry, you may not remember me. I had a canoe." Okay. And he says, "I was falsely accused of a murder or some dead thing, and I'm now facing the death penalty. Could you please intervene on my behalf? Because, of course, I'm innocent." I was like, I don't know anything about this guy. I can't be a character witness for him. What can I do? So in my computer, I have this little letter that says, "Dear Governor, I'm against the death penalty." And I tell all the reasons I'm against it. So I just took that out and exchanged "Dear Governor" for the person in charge in this part of the Philippines. And I printed it out and I signed it and I put a stamp on it and I put it in my mailbox. And I said, "Look, this is what I can do. I can't do anything." Like 5 years later, I got a letter from him saying, "Thank you very much. You intervened. They let me off. And now I'm running a whole program in prisons to help people and to know their rights. And, will you send me $1,000 so I can continue this work?" Anyway, I'm just saying that because you think there's nothing, what can I do? There's nothing I can do. But sometimes there's just one little thing you can do, and you have to let go of it. But you do that, then you let go of it, and maybe something good happens. This guy's life was saved.
Well, great. It's God. It's ripples of hope. Well, then tell me about the Beatitudes, Carrie. I'm going to put you on the spot. And yeah, sorry about that. Um,
Oh
so you
God,
got, blessed
Mother
are those,
Superior at it again.
blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. They will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, they will receive mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, they will see God. Then blessed are the peacemakers, they are the
Yeah,
sons and daughters of God. And then blessed are those persecuted for the sake of justice. The kingdom of God is theirs. So it all builds up to me, in my opinion, to Jesus is this vision of a nonviolent world and just world, hungering and
yeah,
thirst for justice while you're merciful, while you're doing your inner nonviolence, and therefore you're a peacemaker. You're working to end all war and welcome peace, which means justice and is not going to go over well, but you do it
yeah,
anyway. What do you
yeah.
think? How does human rights, your life, fit in? I mean, you're a beatitude person, I think, but can you reflect on any of that for us? We're the Beatitude Center for the Nonviolent Jesus, so
No, I know. It's interesting. I love what I come back to most, what resonates with me there so much, John, is blessed are the peacemakers. So it's not the peace needers, the peace wanters, the peace believers, the peace prayers. It's the makers.
yeah.
So you can't just sit home thinking, I like peace. You gotta go and make it. That's who's blessed. That's activism. That's taking action to create change and make our world better and more just. And I mean, we have a very, very, very good outline of exactly how to do it. And that outline was agreed upon by every nation in the world. And it's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you go and read that, it's like if you take the Beatitudes and you say, how do we put this into action?
Hmm.
Recognize that everybody has a right to free expression. Every person has a right to health care. Every person has a right to water. Every person has a right to a decent job. It's right there. And if you just go through that and say, is my government uh, living up to its obligations, and where it's failing, am I saying something, doing something about it? And incidentally, I just want to say this. We don't all have to do everything. I think everything, we need to imagine the world we want. And that's what you do, John, all the time. You imagine a world of peace. And what does that look like? Well, it's a world of peace. You can't have peace without justice. So it's a world of justice. Okay, so can we get there if we all work on child labor? Well, yeah, we need to work on child labor, but we're not going to solve child labor until we stop violence against women. So we have to work on that. And we can't solve violence against women when the investment community controls all the money in the world, $150 trillion worldwide, only less than 2% is controlled by women and underrepresented minority-owned firms. So we're not going to solve women's rights until we solve that. And we're not going to solve. So the thing is that we have to do everything all at once. So it's perfectly fine if one person in this conversation is devoting themselves to stopping homelessness, and somebody else is working on the war in Sudan, and somebody else is working on nuclear weapons. That's great, because we have to do everything all at once, because all of this has to do with the way to peace.
That's great, Kerry. And together we can do a lot.
Yeah.
I love all that. So I want to call on two friends of mine, Rosie and then Marie Dennis, whom you know, Kerry. So
Oh, do you know
Rosie,
my Marie?
Rosie is graduated from college recently. He's been 10 years an activist, really doing great stuff, and is now just moved this week to Washington, D.C., and helps me out on the computer stuff with the Beatitude Center and works at the Franciscan Action Network. I'm going to let Rosie ask you her question, Kerry, about sustaining for the long haul. This is my friend
Thanks,
Rosie.
John. Hi, I'm Rosie. It's so nice to meet you. I have really admired the work you've done for years, and I'm wondering about what advice you have for young activists, so like me, about how to have sustainability and avoid burnout and things like that. I think that it's easy to get quite tired, and I'm just wondering what advice you have around how to sustain as an activist.
That's good. That's a very good and important question. I think one area of activism is the human resources department of wherever you work. Make sure that they are giving you the resources you need to sustain yourself in the long run. So the mental health, the physical health, the time off, and it should be generous when a tragedy happens in your community, if you're from LA right now, or if if George Floyd is killed and you're African American in our country, you're going to need some time. It's going to be hard. Your colleagues are going to need time. It's going to be hard. And so start there, number one. Number two, take time to talk about your wins and embrace those wins. Activists have this kind of instinct to say, yeah, I got that done. But now that's not what we're talking. We have so much more to do. We have to keep moving. But take time to do that, and with yourself and with your team, because everybody needs to feel like, I think one way of sustaining yourself is by feeling like you're not just walking up that hill and being tossed back down, but that you're making some progress, that you're having some impact. And then I think have fun, like have some balance and have fun. Go out in nature, definitely spend time praying or meditating or some sort of spiritual work, and watch some comedies.
Thank you so much.
That's great advice, Kerry. So, for those of you who don't know, Marie Dennis works with Pax Christi International and is leading the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. Kerry's doing great work on the Vatican with Pope Francis to advocate for nonviolence. Marie, the floor is yours. If you can, yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you, John. And thank you, Kerry. It's great to see you, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Your work really gives me hope right now, because my sense is that the international human rights framework, that commitments that we made after the Second World War in particular, that were centered on human rights, are under threat right now. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what are the consequences? For example, I think you mentioned Honduras as one country where that lost a lawsuit for their violation of human rights. Could you say a little bit about how a country, what are the consequences? I feel as though we have seen the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, human rights organizations point to human rights violations repeatedly in a way that seems pretty evident that their concerns are accurate. And one country after another, or one organization, one business after another, seems to just walk away and say, well, whatever. Could you say a little bit about what are the consequences that are paid when a country loses a lawsuit because of their violation?
I see. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for that. Yeah. So, like I said, there's a Supreme Court that sits above the Supreme Courts of all of Latin America and Africa, and there's another one for Europe, and that's where we do our lawsuits. So, for instance, a few years ago, we won a case on femicide in Guatemala. So, femicide is gender-based homicide, killing women because they're women. Over the past 30 years, 98% of the cases of women being killed in Guatemala never ended up with a case coming to trial. In the 2% where they did come to trial, about 97% of the time, there was no conviction. So basically, in Guatemala, if you kill a woman, nothing happens to you. So we brought a case to the Inter-American Court for Human Rights on that. We won the case. And then they had to make an official apology at a press conference. The head of state had to make an official apology at a press conference to the family. That's a big deal. Then they had to make a financial payout to the family, and that was a big deal. Then they had to there was about a dozen steps, so I'll tell you some of them. They had to put up streetlights in 6 different cities that had never had them before. They had to hire a certain number of women police officers. They had to hire victim witness advocates, which they had never had before. They had to do training of all police officers and judges in the country. on violence against women, domestic violence. They had to create a phone number. Now, I'm sure you're aware of an Amber Alert in this country where your phone starts beeping because some child was abducted. So that was named after a child called the Amber who was abducted. And so in Guatemala, they had to make Christina Isabella alert on everybody's phones so that whenever a woman is abducted, people would get that alert and know about it. So there are things like that that the country has to take. They are steps to assure that this type of violation does not happen again. And that happens in each of our cases. We have about 35 cases at any given time, and we've never lost a case.
That's great. Thank you.
Wow.
That's really, really helpful.
Marie, have another question for Kerry?
I would probably have a million questions, but
Yeah.
mostly just thank you, Kerry, for the great work that you do.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your work. You're such a superhero to all of us.
She's a superhero to all of us. Hey, Kerry, you mentioned when you couldn't get across the river and the CNN thing, I thought you said a connection between the environment and human rights.
Oh yeah, that's what I was doing there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and one of the questions is about climate change. This is all about that. So, but I was very moved by Jane Goodall's statement, whom I guess you were with last week, when
Yes.
she said, I've been struggling for animals, the rights of the creatures for my whole life. And now I'm realizing, well, all the forests are gone. And if I care about the creatures, I have to defend the earth. And she sort of shifted her work. I wonder, climate change is on us full on now, and it's really going to hit us in 5 to 10 years. The scientists are saying there's going to be a noticeable shift. Your thoughts about climate justice and connection to human rights, and then what they did in, was it Bolivia? The president of Bolivia is so interesting, saying, okay, we're working for human rights, but we're also working for the earth has rights. Any thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, I mean, we take a rights-based approach to everything we do. So, for instance, on our cases, we have about 6 cases that are climate related, mostly in Brazil, some in Guatemala, where essentially indigenous people are targeted for falsely accused of whatever, some baloney violation, because they're asserting their right to protect their land from a mining company.
Yes.
Primarily. And then we take up their case at the Inter-American Court. This often ends up with people dying. And it's often because the government is in collusion with the international mining company. And that's what was happening in the Philippines when I was there in 1990. And that's happening, of course, all over the world now. Yeah. So we have several cases like that. And frankly, these are also very, very, very often tied to women's rights, because 70% of the farmers in the world are women. Mm. And so women are really on the front lines. They're the first to know when there's a climate crisis, because they're the ones who are planting the seeds and walking the extra miles to get the water, and seeing when the drought sets in or when the flood happens. So as we were saying earlier, all of these things are very much tied together. But I guess I want to end. Are we at the end?
Yeah, we're nearly at the end. Just
Nearly
a
at the
couple
end.
minutes left.
I would say this, John, I started working in human rights in 1981. And at that time, all of Latin America was under right-wing military dictatorships. And today there's not a right-wing military dictatorship standing. All of Eastern Europe was under communism. South Africa was at the height of apartheid. Women's rights was not on the international agenda. LGBTQ rights, not on the agenda. And all the today, Latin America, no more right-wing military dictatorships. Eastern Europe, no more communism. South Africa's had freely elected governments elected by a majority of their people. Women's rights are always on the international agenda. They're going to be talked about. They might not be successfully changed, but they're going to be talked about, and LGBTQ rights are going to be talked about. And those changes happen not because governments or militaries or multinationals wanted them to. In fact, all those powerful groups tried to stop them. They happen because small groups of determined people, like the people on this call, harnessed the dream of freedom and made it come true, and worked together and found allies, and worked together and said, we can do this, and worked together at the grassroots level, and then went and got people in power to help them. And that's how it works. That's how change comes. So we must not sit there and say, oh, woe is me, Donald Trump is reelected. Can you believe what a mess our country is, and LA is burning down? So we can all do that all the time. But that's not what we're here for. We need to remember our victories and embrace, we know the tools to how to create change. And we can do this. We're supposed to do this. That's why we're on this earth. And we're going to make, those Beatitudes come true.
Well, wow. How about a round of applause for Kerry Kennedy? Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have 50 more questions for you, but that sums everything up. That sums up, it's also the spiritual life, Kerry. You're right. That's why we're here on earth, to make the Beatitudes come true, to make justice and God's peace come true on earth. You've given us all a big ripple of hope. And a big shot in the arm, and it's been a pleasure and a delight, speaking on behalf of everybody, to be with you and thank you for giving us this time, and thank you for your extraordinary life and all your great works. I just, before I sign off, want to make a few commercial announcements, but I'll be in touch, Kerry, and I again sincerely thank you, and if I can do anything for you, let me know. I owe you now.
Thanks.
So, friends, the next Zoom is in 2 weeks with our friend Kathy Kelly. Kerry, I wish you knew Kathy. She's probably the leading peace activist in the United States, who went to Iraq 30 times. She led my delegation with Nobel Peace Prize winners there in the 90s, and then went to Afghanistan 30 times. And has protested against nuclear weapons, and has been in Palestine and Yemen and Syria. She's going to talk about working for peace in a world of permanent war. And like Kerry said, continuing to keep at it. That's in 2 weeks. And then Marissa Guerin will be talking the flip side of that. We'll learn the lessons from Therese of Lisieux about maintaining your nonviolence and strength and your inner peace and connection with God as you work for peace and justice. And then, as you may know, I've started this weekly free global podcast called the Nonviolent Jesus Podcast. And it's now everywhere on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, the front page of the National Catholic Reporter, and the Beatitude Center. And on Monday, Kerry Martin Sheen's is on. I recorded it with him. And I hope you all listen to him, folks, because he's, as Kerry knows, so much fun, so upbeat and positive, and just encouraging us to go forward and follow Jesus. The following week, instead of the inauguration, listen to my friend Dr. Bernard Lafayette. I presume you know him, Kerry. He was Dr. King's personal assistant, John Lewis's best friend, one of the civil rights movement's leaders. After that, Sister Helen Prejean, Father Richard Rohr, Sister Joan Chittister. It's really exciting. And they're all free. You could help spread the word about that. I'd appreciate that. So, Kerry, we're all deeply grateful. You've given me a lot of hope and inspiration. I'm sure you have for everybody. Again, everybody, why don't you join me in thanking Kerry for giving us her precious time. We wish you all the best. Many,
Thank you.
many blessings to you and your family. And we thank you. I thank your parents, Kerry, and I miss your mom so much. And so I send you off with love and gratitude, and I'll be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Okay. So
Thanks.
I'm going to turn off the recording, but I'll stay on for those who want to stay on. So God bless everybody, and see you next time at the Beatitude Center. Thanks for being here, everybody. Bye-bye.